We've left one loose end in this discussion, Professor Searle, which I want to take up and tie up before we bring the programme to an end. When you were earlier on sketching out the whole state of the subject, you mentioned linguistics, and in particular the work of Chomsky, as being an important feature in the landscape. I think I must ask you, before we do finally conclude, to say just a little bit briefly about him.
Yes. Well, of course, Chomsky, I think it's no exaggeration to say, produced a revolution in linguistics. What he did was take syntax as central to language. Now, that wasn't just the revolution. That had been done before him, but he took it in a particular way. He asked the question, how can we get a finite set of rules that will generate all and only the sentences of a language? And then he showed that these rules had to have certain very special logical features. But the impact that this has had on philosophy is quite interesting, and it's in different realms that it's had. One obvious thing is that it's given us new syntactical tools to do studies of language. I mean, in my own case, for example, I use some of Chomsky's apparatus to try to show how different speech acts are realized in different syntactical forms in English, and I think one could do similar studies for other languages. But more importantly, I think, in Chomsky, he was led to the following conclusion. The syntax that he came up with was extremely abstract and complicated. And that raised the question, how can little kids learn that? I mean, you can't teach a small child axiomatic set theory. Chomsky showed that English is much more complicated than axiomatic set theory. How is it that little kids can learn that? And his answer was quite interesting. What he said was, in a sense, they already know it. It's a mistake to suppose that the mind is a blank tablet. What happens is that the form of all natural human languages is programmed into the child's mind at birth. I mean, in his strongest moments, Chomsky says, that the child has a perfect knowledge of universal grammar at birth, and then his exposure to language just triggers this antecedent knowledge, and it's realized in the different natural human languages. Now, there used to be a traditional objection to this idea of a universal grammar. People would say, but languages are so different. English is so different from Chinese. Chomsky's answer to that was that though they're different on the surface, they have a common underlying or deep structure, and it's that which is programmed into the child's mind. Now, that seems to me Chomsky's positive contribution, and I think it really is remarkable. But there are, I think, certain limitations, and those limitations have to do with the present disarray in linguistics. Chomsky sees man as essentially a syntactical animal. He never asks such questions as, well, what are these syntactical forms used for? And his notion of syntax is that the theory of the syntax of language must be stated in purely syntactical terms. That is, we're not allowed to say what these forms mean or how people are supposed to use them. And Chomsky has actually denied what seems to me to be true, namely that the purpose of language is communication. He doesn't think that that's the case. I mean, he thinks that...
he thinks it's expression.
Well, that's right, and that language, the essence of language is syntax, and that we have the syntax programmed into us, that we are, as I said, syntactical animals. Now, I think that leads to a certain limitation in his research. I think that the most interesting questions about syntax have to do with how form and function interact. And I want to ask the question, what are these syntactical forms for? Language, for me, is to talk with and to write with. So I want to say that the study of the syntax will always be incomplete unless we get a study of linguistic use. Now, it's a factual question. I mean, the research in the end, in the long haul, it might show that he was right and I am wrong. But my gut feel is that we will not get an understanding of syntax of language and how language evolved without a conception of what human beings use language to do. And that's back to speech acts.
Well, Professor Searle, you've given us an excellent survey, I think, of what the present situation is in the philosophy of language and also how it developed out of the past. Would you, and I put this to you as my very last question, would you conclude this discussion by hazarding some informed guesses
I'll
about
try.
How it's going to develop in the immediate future?
Yes, I'll try. I left my crystal ball in Berkeley, but I'll see what I can do without it. First of all, I think linguistics is now such a booming subject that that's bound to continue. Partly because it's so well funded. And I think linguists and philosophers are going to find each other useful. I mean, we're interacting more than we did in the past. I find myself speaking at linguistics conferences and inviting linguists to come and speak in philosophy conferences. So I think, though the Chomskyan paradigm has broken down, there isn't the kind of unified development of linguistics as a science that there once seemed when in the heyday of Chomsky's paradigm. Though the field is in kind of a mess, it seems to me that is going to continue. I mean, that the field will continue to develop. Linguistics will be a source of enormous usefulness for the philosopher of language, even though, of course, the direction of the interest that the linguist and the philosopher has are different. The linguist's interest is factual, empirical. He wants to know what are the facts about language. The philosopher really is more conceptual. He wants to know how is meaning and communication possible at all. His question, to use old-fashioned jargon, is transcendental. It's not just empirical. So that's one thing that I think will continue. Now, another thing I think is really having a kind of a boom in England and in certain parts of the United States now is the work of Quine and Davidson, and especially Davidson's idea that you can get a theory of meaning by way of a theory of truth. The thing that is so appealing about that is you get well-defined questions. I mean, you get questions that you can state using the apparatus of modern mathematical logic, and you get the sort of questions that Austin liked, incidentally, questions where cooperative group effort could produce results. So I think that vein is by no means worked out. We're going to see a lot of interesting work done in the Davidsonian tradition. And finally, I want to say that the kind of stuff I'm interested in, I think, is going to continue to interest people. And I'm quite interested to see that on the European continent, where for so long there seemed really a kind of iron curtain between the way they did philosophy and the way we did philosophy. I mean, French and German philosophy seem so different from Anglo-American philosophy. They're now getting more and more interested in precisely this aspect of language that we've been talking about. So I see at least these three strands of work going. Post-Chomsky, and of course I'm including Chomsky himself in what I call post-Chomsky linguistics, will continue to develop. I see more and more work going on in formal semantics of the Davidsonian kind, and I think a lot of useful work is going to be done there. And then I see these problems about language usage and intentionality. That seems to me a very rich field.
More and more work in the Searlean kind as well. Thank you very much, Professor Searle.
Thank you.